All right, so I am Susan Forney from Hurricane Electric, and I am so happy to be at UKNOF again. It's one of my favorite meetings because you guys are so friendly. I love being here. And I'm here to talk about IPv6 at 25 years. So let's take a look. So IPv6 turned 25 in December. And I think those of you who have turned 25 probably remember that milestone birthday yourself when your friends said helpful things like, wow, 25 years, that's a long time. That's a quarter of a century. Yeah, it is kind of a long time. But as old as that is, IPv4 is actually 40 years old this year. And while that's kind of young for retirement by human standards, I think it's time to take a look at IPv6, which is the protocol which is supposed to make that happen. So let's see how it's doing. Now, I thought it might be useful to start with a trip down memory lane for IPv6. To see where it has been in the last 25 years. It started out as a protocol in 1995 with RFC 1881, which documented the address management, and then RFC 1883, released almost exactly the same time, which actually documented the protocol specification. But the next milestone isn't until 4 years later in 1999, when Aaron, Apnick, and Ripe actually received their first allocations of /23 IPv6 blocks so that people could actually use it. The next thing that happened on my timeline is that Microsoft added IPv6 to the stack of both of its operating systems, which allowed everyday garden variety users to have access to IPv6. And also, Hurricane Electric got its first IPv6 block in 2001. In 2002, LACNIC got its 23, so Latin American users could get IPv6 addresses. And Sprint and Apple deployed IPv6 in 2003, Apple for its operating systems. So that was let a lot of the community users be able to use it. Then in 2004, Afrinic became the last ISP to get, or last RIR rather, to get its 23 allocation. So now all the RIRs by 2004 had IPv6 address to hand out. In 2007, Hurricane Electric converted its entire backbone to native IPv6. And in 2008, the US government announced that it was IPv6 capable across all of its systems, and the EU set a goal to have 25% of its systems IPv6 capable by 2010. In 2009, Google joins everyone by allowing its search and maps to be available over IPv6. It also added support for Android at that point. And in 2012, 17 years after IPv6 first became a protocol, we finally had World IPv6 Launch Day. And then on 2017, we finally got IPv6 as an internet standard. So that's where it went. Now, as a further historic point, I thought, well, I address why it's not IPv5. And that's because, of course, for those of you who know, there already was an IPv5. It was actually more commonly known as ST, and it was the experimental internet stream protocol, and it wasn't defined in an RFC until 1990. I think that was RFC 1190 for those trivia buffs. But the ST was not a complete waste of time, because the concepts in it became seen later in the asynchronous transfer mode protocols, and also in MPLS. So ST actually kind of lives today, even though people don't remember it as IPv5. And it wasn't useful as a protocol to succeed IPv4 because it was also on a 32-bit addressing structure. So to find out how IPv6 is faring for adoption, and to see where it has come since 1995, I'm going to look at three things. First, the number of users that are routed over the internet, which is over 30% now. The IPv6 routing table, which has exceeded 100,000 routes. And access to the internet, which is driving IPv6 adoption. So let's take a look at those three things. First, we take a look at the number of countries who have adopted IPv6, and I'm going to look at in this graph at the top 50, because there's obviously 200 countries, and that would be too many for a graph. What's kind of interesting on this graph is that we have everything from Belgium in the first place and Colombia in last place, and that goes from over 50% for Belgium and to over 10% for Colombia. But what's really interesting about this graph is who's not in it, which is China and Russia, which are two very large countries, but they don't make the top 50. Now, let's look at the top 10 countries who've adopted IPv6. In first place is Belgium. And I know when you hear Belgium, you don't think IPv6, you probably think waffles or beer, but actually Belgium consistently tops the list of countries adopting IPv6 and the amount of, at their adoption rate, because Belgium was one of the first countries to experience a shortage of IPv6, and it had a community of engineers that help foster adoption. So that's how they ended up in first place. It's not an accident. India's spot is also due to a shortage of IPv4 space. And Sci-Fi technologies in India actually rolled out IPv6 as early as 2005 because it was a problem for them. Germany is in third place, largely due to its telecoms, starting with Deutsche Telekom, who rolled out IPv6 to their DSL customers in 2012. Telecom Malaysia also owes its fourth place to Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi and mobile deployments that needed a lot of IP space. Greece, also another unassuming country you might not consider to be a leader in IPv6, actually has been in the top 10 countries for over 5 years. Taiwan's place also is not a surprise because CHT recently went on an ambitious campaign to roll out IPv6 across its mobile and landline services, which was how Taiwan got into the top 10. Vietnam actually has been inching its way into the top 10 countries deploying IPv6 since 2019, and that's mostly due to an explosion of mobile devices in its country. The United States also, like Germany, has big telcos to thank for its place. Comcast, Time Warner, and AT&T deployed IPv6 in 2011. Then Google Fiber, CenturyLink, and Charter followed in 2012, and T-Mobile and Verizon followed in 2013. So that was a large number of telcos deploying IPv6 addressing to their end users, and it pushed them up. Also, the United States does happen to be home to Hurricane Electric, which has the distinction of being the first network to reach 200 unique IPv6 network adjacencies. It's a little bit more than that today. When I checked this morning, it was 5,597. So still growing there. Luxembourg is not an accident in 9th position. Its telecom providers actually have had IPv6 in production since 2009. And then Switzerland also is not a stranger to this list. In 2013, they actually had the largest IPv6 adoption percentage in the world, thanks in large part to Swisscom. You know, one of the funny things about IPv6 is that its adoption takes pressure off the supply of IPv4 addresses. So adopting IPv6 actually makes it less compelling as you take the pressure off of IPv4, which is the whole reason to adopt IPv6. And so for all of you who have not deployed IPv6 yet or have not used it in a meaningful way, you really owe a round of applause to all these people for making it possible for you to still have IPv4 addresses. So the next thing I want to look at is the growth of the routing tables. And if we start with IPv4 quickly here, we're going to see that about a decade ago, it had about 341,000 routes in the table. And when I took this snapshot, when I started making these slides at the beginning of the month, it was only like about 860,000 routes in the table for at the beginning of 2021. And, you know, that's an impressive growth. That looks like a nice line. So let's see how IPv6 looks. And that actually is a pretty good curve. We start out with 4,200 routes in 2011, and we passed 100,000 routes in December. And now we're at over 105,000 routes in the beginning of 2021. So that's pretty good. So now let's take a look and see how they compare. And yeah, you know, look at that IPv4. That makes the IPv6 graph look pretty small, but does it really? So let's take a look. If we actually compare the percentage increase each year, you can see that actually, even though it looks kind of dwarfed on that last graph, that IPv6 routes have been growing at a very impressive rate. They started out with that gangbuster increase in 2012 of 84%, almost 85%, and still growing at a clip of around 30% a year throughout the rest of the decade. And you can see that IPv4 address space growth has actually been pretty small in comparison. If you really want to see how small, I did a year-over-year percentage graph of this growth. And you can see that over the last decade, that IPv6 has grown over 340%, whereas IPv4 address table growth has been about 90%. So I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that's probably all well and good, but IPv6 has just 100,000 routes after 25 years. And so that doesn't sound that impressive, but does anybody want to guess when IPv4 had 100,000 routes? Well, that was in 2001. And in 2001, IPv4 was only 20 years old, because remember, the RFC for IPv4 came out in 1981. So it took 20 years for IPv4 to get to 100,000 routes. And also remember that IPv6, while it was defined in 1995, it didn't even have route addresses to give out to people until 1999. So in closely the same amount of time, both protocols, it took both protocols to reach 100,000 routes. So that's starting to look pretty good for IPv6. But now that we've established that the internet adoption is progressing pretty well, and we have lots of routes in the table, let's look at the last reason why getting IPv6 on your network is a good idea now instead of later. And that's because not everyone in the world is on the internet yet. If we look at this table here, we see that the world's population of about 7.6 billion, 60% of the world has access to the internet, and about 39.93 or 40% of the world does not. So let's look at why that's important. If we look at global internet usage, I've put this chart together, and the blue line is the total number of users worldwide who have access to the internet. The green line is developed countries like Belgium, and the orange line is developing countries like places like Bangladesh, who incidentally started deploying IPv6 in 2017. Now, you can see that the developing world in 2005 had about 8% of its users, 8% of its population with access to the internet, and the developed world had 51%. But in 2005, the overall percentage was 16%. And for those of you good at math, that tells you that there are many more people, obviously, in the developing countries than there are in the developed world. Now, once we get to the 2020, we can see that about 87% of the world, of the developed nations, have IPv6, rather internet access, versus about 52% for the developing countries. So now, if we take a look at how that percentage is, again, if we look at percentage year-over-year growth, we can see that the developing countries are actually gaining access to the internet at a much faster rate than the developed world, which ramped up rather slowly. The developing world is ramping up very quickly. And what that means is that 40% we saw in that last graph that don't have access to the internet yet probably will pretty soon. And there aren't enough IP4 addresses to make that happen. So IPv6 is going to be the way it does. So IPv6 is not only outpacing IPv4 in its routing tables and internet and and adoption and access and global access, but it also is outpacing it in security. RPKI is a crucial tool in preventing prefix and hijacking and routing leaks. And IPv6 prefixes are more likely to have an RPKI ROA than IPv4. And this is important because you don't go to the trouble of making an RPKI ROA for a prefix you're not going to use. So if we look at this first chart here, we can see that I pulled this last week. The global IPv4 RPKI story is that about 27% of the prefixes in IPv4 have ROAs, about 26 of them valid, about 1% unvalid, and about 73% of those prefixes do not have ROAs. But in IPv6, 32% of the prefixes have ROAs, and 68% are unknown. So the adoption rate of getting ROAs for your prefixes in IPv6 is outpacing the pace for IPv4, and this actually has been true for several years. If you want to look at where the work needs to be done to get RPKI adopted, it's helpful to know how much of the internet is in each RIR, because I'm going to look at these by RIR. And AFRINIC has a very small percentage of both the IPv4 and IPv6 space. This is less of a problem for IPv6 because there's enough IPv6 for AFRINIC to have all that it wants, but right now it only wants a small percentage. The rest of the RIRs have more or less, the same amount of IPv6 space, but you can see that the IPv4 space is not distributed very evenly. ARIN has a disproportionate amount of the IPv4 space. Then if we go down and we look at the percentage of RIRs that have with prefix announced as having ROAs, then if you look at IPv4 to IPv6, this is how you can see IPv6 looks pretty good. In most of the RIRs, you have far more of the prefixes in IPv6 having ROAs than the prefixes in IPv4. And then last, if we just do a quick comparison to IPv6 ROAs related to the prefix announcements by RIR, you can see that actually that's why IPv6 is doing so well. AFRINIC has, again, about 1% of the announced IPv6 prefixes, but it has 22% of the ROAs in the table that are documented. It has APNIC has about 30% of the ROAs. ARIN has about 18%. And this isn't as big of a problem as in IPv4 because they only have 22% of the table. LACNIC has a huge amount of ROAs, about 30% of its table is in ROAs, and then RIPE leads the way with 46%, thanks to in no small part about the amount of effort they have made to get people to sign their prefixes. So it's very clear that IPv6 adoption is making progress because over 30% of the world's internet users are routed over IPv6, and this is growing steadily. And the routing table is growing at an impressive rate and outpacing the growth of the IPv4 table. And the global number of internet users is increasing rapidly. And at the end of the day, IPv6 is the only one that has room for them. So I would like to thank you for your kind attention and inviting me to speak again at UKNOF. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm afraid that we're actually short on time now. So if you're okay to stay for Mattermost, Susan, and take any questions there, that I think would be the best place to carry on the conversation.
I would be happy to do that.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your fascinating talk, looking over the history of IPv6.